except for its severity. And the deaths were enormous. So all of this happened right when I was about to start graduate school in sociology. And I thought there was something really interesting here to understand. And I wanted to understand, more about who died in the heat wave and why they died. And the first obvious thing that, everyone had picked up on was that most of the victims were older, significantly more likely to die in heat if you're over 65, and even more if you're over 75. That became very clear. It was also very clear that people who were socially isolated were at a much higher risk. And by social isolation, I mean people who lacked regular contact with friends or with family or neighbors. Living alone was a big risk factor in the heat wave as it happens.
ולפני זה, אנחנו רק רוצים
as it happens. But one of the funny things about Zoom is you can always figure out who's the one who forgot to turn the mute off, because as soon as your sound goes off, you pop to the top of the screen. So Yasmin, you have one X mark now, but it's okay. So living alone in isolation was a real risk factor, and Chicago and the US has more people who are aging alone than ever before. And I know this is the case for Israel too. This is a big issue. We're living longer than ever before, but we're growing increasingly concerned about social isolation as a consequence of that. So those are big factors. But there was also a very clear geographical arrangement of the deaths, and it maps on very perfectly to the story of racial segregation and class segregation in Chicago. So the first thing I did, as a sociologist, was to draw a map of who died and where. And it becomes really clear that, the communities that were at greatest risk of heat deaths were Black and poor. They lived on the South Side. They lived on the West Side of Chicago. Now, this, for anyone who's ever studied social science, is probably the least interesting, least surprising finding in the history of the social sciences. There's nothing interesting about the fact that when there's a heat wave, people who are really vulnerable all the time are going to suffer the most. That's the community. We would expect this. It's what happened. It's not interesting. I mean, it's politically important to know this, right? Because if you're a policymaker and you're concerned about staving off death and destruction, if you want to prevent illness, you know that you should target your resources at the communities that are most likely to experience harm, right? So as a policy matter, this is incredibly important. To think about how are you going to help people. As a sociological matter, is not very interesting at all. It's what we would predict.